25 years ago, I was a student in the PhD program, and Dr. Timothy George was my advisor, the main advisor. And one day he called me into his office. It was back in May of 1988. And he said, "I'm sorry to tell you, but I'm leaving. My loss was your gain 25 years ago. And I feel so blessed and grateful for the work that God has done through him here in this community. And I celebrate and I rejoice these 25 years of Beeson Divinity School." You have been hearing a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I'm privileged to be asked to be here again, third time at Beeson, and to talk about one witness in particular, witness in the company of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Among the cloud of witnesses and resistors during the Nazi era, Bonhoeffer certainly has assumed a prominent place. Highly educated and from a privileged family, Bonhoeffer was well connected and part of no less than 3 resistance groups. These were, as you well know, the Confessing Church, a loose confederation of Germany's Protestant churches, Die Abwehr, Hitler's counterintelligence agency, and the Kreisau Circle, a group that actively was planning for a new government and constitution after Hitler's overthrow. Only about 60 resistance groups are known to have existed at the time in Germany. And their membership was relatively small. It ranged from a handful to a few dozen, which of course minimized the risk of discovery and deportation. Most critics of the Nazi regime, however, most of those who criticized and objected to the regime's idolatry and power abuse remained unaffiliated. And this meant that their voice was a lone one, speaking out either privately or, in rare cases, in public. One of these unaffiliated public voices belonged to someone dubbed the evangelist and the apostle of Munich. Today, his grave draws up to 3,000 people a day to the Bürgersaal Church in downtown Munich, right in the pedestrian zone. 250,000 signatures had petitioned for his beatification, which was granted in 1987 by Pope John Paul II. His admirers could not be more diverse. Die-hard war veterans and conscientious objectors, members of traditionalists' men's groups, and participants of youth rallies all visit and embrace as their own this Jesuit priest and the first German Jesuit to be beatified. A decorated war veteran and an amputee, he had been known for his tireless pastoral and charitable work among the city's poorest and his courage to speak the truth in a quaint and kindly straightforward fashion. "They can gun me down," he once said, "but the truth must be told." This truth he preached from Munich's pulpits, on mission tours in Bavaria, and at public gatherings, often objecting to the regime's forceful secularizing of Catholic schools and the Nazi slur campaign against clergy. Restricted first and eventually forbidden to preach altogether, he was pressured into breaking the confessional secrecy, arrested repeatedly, deported to a concentration camp, and finally exiled to solitary confinement at a Benedictine monastery. When 5 years later, at the end of the war, he returned to Munich, he resumed his pastoral duties and succumbed to a heart attack while preaching. Rupert Meyer had been sent to Munich by his Jesuit superiors to evangelize the unchurched. Many of them had flocked from rural areas, but ended up being uprooted, impoverished, and unemployed. And Meyer reached out to them through tireless and frequent personal home visits, charitable efforts, and newly created pastoral care teams. I know no other way to reach people in the city than through the home visit, the repeated home visit by the clergy, he says. When the priest goes up the stairs and down the stairs, when he climbs all the way up to the 5th and 6th floors, when he shows his human side, shows understanding, even when he gets to hear a great deal of scolding, then perhaps the ice may melt. In addition to serving as pastor at the downtown Jesuit church, he also became the spiritual head of a newly formed congregation of religious. In addition to being the preacher of a Catholic organization of laymen and the founder of an evangelistic outreach ministry at Munich's Central Railroad Station. "If people don't come to church," he used to say, "we have to bring the church to them." This meant that Meyer held at the train station up to 5 Sunday morning worship services aimed at weekend travelers and railroad and postal employees. On average, Meyer preached 70 times a month, in addition to raising money for charitable ministries and helping people find jobs. After 11 years in Munich, Meyer was well known in the city. When in 1923 he climbed the podium during one of Hitler's rallies at a Munich beer hall, that is 10 years before Hitler was elected Reich Chancellor, Meyer was greeted with rousing applause. The gathered crowd assumed they had won him over for Hitler's political platform. But bedlam ensued when Meyer solemnly declared, "You have applauded too soon, because I will now tell you point blank that a German Christian can never be a National Socialist. Besides," he added, "it's totally incorrect to say that the gospel is only there for the German people." In 1934, an official complaint was filed against Meyer, and Nazi spies were taking down his sermons, leading to a preaching ban outside Munich 3 years later. In June 1937, Meyer was arrested for what was called abuse of the chancel privilege and defamation against the state. Only protests from the Vatican affected his release. The same year, the Nazis launched a slur campaign against the church and pastors on account of sexual abuse and misconduct charges. Meyer digressed from the lectionary throughout that year and instead chose to speak from the pulpit. Remember, dear friends, remember that not everything is true that's printed in the paper. And even if some of it is true, these portrayals are exaggerated and sensationalized, and all is being played up big and then gutted. What we also object to, he says, is the broad and generalizing way of such portrayals. We will definitely need to defend ourselves here. No, we're not revolutionaries, but if things continue like this, we Catholic and Protestant clergy alike will have to throw in there a stink bomb. The following year, Meyer was arrested again and released, this time with a complete ban on preaching. In prison, Meyer made the following written statement: I declare that in the case of my release, I will, based on fundamental convictions, continue to preach both in the churches of Munich and in the rest of Bavaria, despite the preaching injunction. I will continue to defend the church from the pulpit against any attacks with all decisiveness and honesty and sharpness, the same as I did before. I will continue to preach in the way I have been, even if the government, the police, and the courts should consider my sermons acts to be punishable by law. In 1938, Meyer was arrested for the third time, and this time taken to a concentration camp where Martin Niemöller was also. During this time of solitary confinement, Meyer's health began to decline rapidly. Fearful of being held responsible for the death of a beloved priest, Hitler and the secret police negotiated a way to keep Meyer alive while ensuring his silence. In August of 1940, Meyer was transferred to a Benedictine monastery, the monastery at Ettal, where he was placed under permanent house arrest. In November of that year, Dietrich Bonhoeffer went on retreat there for 3 months in order to work on his ethics. But while Bonhoeffer was a guest, Meyer was a prisoner. His mail was censored, visitors were limited to his order's superior and doctors, and all pastoral ministry, including preaching and the hearing of confessions and pastoral care, was disallowed. For the preacher, with a burning love for souls, this was severe punishment. Meyer writes about his stay there, saying, "Since then," meaning since I have been here, "I am like a living corpse," because this type of death is to someone like me who is still so full of life, much worse than the physical death for which I had so often prepared. 5 years later, the Americans liberated Ettal, and Meyer returned to Munich. "If God so chooses," he remarked, "a one-legged Jesuit can outlive a godless dictatorship of 1,000 years." In his opening sermon to a packed Bürgersaal church in downtown Munich, Meyer pleaded for forgiveness and unity. "Dear friends," he said, "since we saw one another last, something terrible has happened to you. With deep pain and bitter sorrow, I heard about it all, and everything was told to me that you and your loved ones had to endure during all these years. But remember," Meyer continued, "even though we would have arranged things differently, our Lord has allowed it. And if God has ordained it like that, then it is well. Moreover, we should not always dwell on what we have lost. It is not good to daily recall the hard times. We must not think only of what we have lost, of the death of a loved one, but also of what our loved one has gained. He wouldn't want to trade with us now. He has entered the kingdom of light and glory. He is with God, and through God he has obtained everything." In closing, Meyer also addressed the comments of the foreign press. They are saying, "How could the German people stand by and witness the horror of the concentration camps? Why didn't they protest?" I want to give you only a few words of explanation. The German people, meaning the simple folk, the common people, could not do anything about it. It is a great injustice and only shows that those who are writing things like that have no grasp of the situation in which we have lived for so long. On the other hand, there were highly educated, highly respected and capable people, people of high repute in Germany, who could have gained a hearing among the Allies and also among the German people if only they had put their head on the chopping block and had drawn more attention to the situation here. But this too required enormous effort. So you see, dear friends, one cannot blame other people. And now we want to make it clear that the kingdom of God will be on the rise again, and it needs help and helpers. So let's rejoice. God's church needs helpers from every corner of our nation, and we don't want to shirk off responsibility. As far as it depends on us, we will meet the call, and with our whole heart, we will stand up for Christ's kingdom, for God's church. After his return, Meyer had eagerly resumed his pastoral duties and his preaching. Within the next 3 months, Meyer also wrote 324 letters, the majority of which was sent to the Allies on behalf of those who had belonged to the Nazi Party and who now suffered from the Allies' denazification measures. As I have been told, writes Meyer, R.H. has been relieved of his position as principal teacher. Mr. H. is considered an excellent teacher throughout the region. He's a very good influence on the children entrusted to him, which the church community appreciates greatly. The reason for his joining the Nazi Party was because during these crazy times, it was considered proper form for teachers to belong to the party. Otherwise, this good-natured Catholic teacher would never have joined the party. Personally, he never had anything in common with them. I urgently request that the matter of Mr. H.'s dismissal as principal teacher be reconsidered. In another letter, Meyer writes, I hereby declare that I have known Mrs. E.K. of Munich for quite some time, and that I had with her several in-depth conversations, and that I'm firmly convinced that this woman has credibility. Yes, her husband belonged to the SS, but Mrs. K. herself never had any connection with the SS. On the contrary, she refused to take her children out of the church despite the severest threats, and even refused to accept from her husband any kind of alimony for the raising of the 6 children. This is a rare case, which makes me bold to suggest that the seizing of her bank assets be immediately lifted. After 2 mild strokes, Meyer relinquished his office as pastor to the male congregation. 3 weeks later, Meyer was preaching at St. Michael's Church in Munich when a stroke stopped his speech. For minutes, he remained standing, propped by his leg prosthesis, until his confreres carried him out of the church. Within hours, Meyer died at the hospital, and soon it was said of him that Father Meyer never buckled under, not even while dying. Meyer was buried at the Jesuit cemetery several miles outside Munich, but soon his burial place became a pilgrimage site, and so it was deemed necessary to move his remains to downtown Munich. And 3 years later, his casket was taken on foot to the Jesuit church downtown in a procession attended by no less than 30,000 people. Thanks be to God.